The war against Tamils conducted by the Sri Lankan government for decades have been heard, and the genocide that has taken place in May 2009 is being recognised and questioned by the international communities. It's our duty as a Tamil diaspora to continue to work hand in hand with these international communities who are willing to support us. By working together, we Tamils can get justice.
Ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, the great Tamil nation, the great Tamil people scattered around the world, whom I met over many years, many occasions, shining bright communities in many different countries across the world. Today it's a great honor to be with you to mark the Muli Vaikal genocide. Genocide that happened in the past, like Rwanda genocide, the genocide in Timor-Leste throughout the 70s all the way to 99, 2000. The killing fields in Cambodia, the killing fields in Indonesia itself in 1965-66, the ongoing tragedies in South Sudan, in Syria. These are the man-made, human-made tragedies that shock all of us in this 21st century. Humanity does not seem to have learned from the tragedies of the past. I don't need to go back to before World War II. Let's stay with World War II and since the genocide of the Jewish people, the apocalypse, the killing of gypsies in Europe by the Nazi regime, and then massacres across Latin America, in the conflicts in Central America, throughout the African continent, the carpet bombing of Vietnam and Cambodia by the United States, with the use of chemical weapons like Orange Agent, whose effect we still see today. And not to mention the atomic bomb and drop on Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Since the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka. On this anniversary, we remember all those who were killed or disappeared during almost 3 decades of war, including during the last phase of the war in Muli Vaikal in 2009. We honor their memory and we pay tribute to the hundreds of thousands of others affected, those who were displaced, those who lost loved ones, those whose communities were forever changed.
Welcome. I join in the remembrance of the Tamil victims of the war in Sri Lanka that ended on the 18th of May 2009. Close to 146,000 Tamils lost their lives in 6 decades of struggling for self-determination. So on this Remembrance Day, it's important that we honor the Tamil victims and we inspire ourselves to continue their struggle for justice, freedoms, and reparation for their losses. The United Nations investigations determined that during the war in Sri Lanka, international crimes such as war crimes and crimes against humanity were committed, and yet there has been no judicial mechanism, no perpetrators have been brought to justice. And recently, in a cynical move, the president pardoned and released from prison the only one soldier, an army sergeant, who had been convicted by the courts and sentenced to prison for killing 8 civilians, including a child. And he was just released by the president last month. This is a far cry from justice. Tamils continue in Sri Lanka to suffer all kinds of prejudice, discrimination, and violation of their human rights. The lands that were stolen from them by the military have still not been restored. And the Tamil language has now been excluded from the national anthem. In the past, there were always 2 languages, and almost 200 people are still in detention. This is why, because of the continuing violations of the rights of Tamils, all of us should join the international community in collective action to realize the rights of Tamils people, to ensure that they have justice and reparation redress in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
And colleagues, thank you for inviting me to send this message of support. As we commemorate the 11th anniversary of the 18th of May, I and my colleagues at the International Truth and Justice Project would like to pay tribute to the tens of thousands of victims who lost their lives during the final phase of the war. We would also like to extend our condolences to the survivors and families of the missing and the disappeared. We find it absolutely outrageous that so many years after the conflict has ended, we are unable as yet to put a final number to those who lost their lives. In the last few years, we have seen the mothers of the disappeared at great risk to themselves protest and continue to demand answers from the authorities as well as the Office of Missing Persons as to the fate and whereabouts of their loved ones. Despite their entreaties, the Sri Lankan government and the security forces have continued to deny any involvement in the enforced disappearance of those who surrendered into their custody. Here at the ITJP, our mission is not only to document the stories of the survivors, but also to collect and preserve evidence of war crimes and crimes against humanity, so that one day in the future we can hold those responsible accountable. We have, of course, in the last 5 years, continued to use the evidence in our possession to name and shame those most responsible for the killings and to ensure that we are able, where possible, to prosecute them under universal jurisdiction. We have succeeded in ensuring that some of them are not able to travel or to serve in UN peacekeeping missions. We have also put the international community on notice that since Gotabaya Rajapaksa assumed the presidency in Sri Lanka, that he has surrounded himself with military officials who are implicated in war crimes and crimes against humanity, as well as fraud and corruption. Some observers have called this the normalization of military influence in the civilian sphere as informal networks become formal under this regime. This is, of course, a stark reminder to those who continue to do business with this government that they should not be surprised that under the guise of COVID-19, violations continue with members of minority communities, particularly Tamils and Muslims, targeted and persecuted. While justice for these crimes may take a long time, I ask that you don't lose faith and that all of us remain committed to the cause of truth recovery and justice. It is imperative that we continue to tell the story of those who lost their lives so that their deaths will not have been in vain. I thank you.
Vanakkam. For decades, Tamil people have experienced a campaign of genocide at the hands of the Sri Lankan government. From the burning of the Jaffna Library, to the anti-Tamil violence in what is known as Black July in 1983, to the thousands of Tamils killed in the Mullawaikal massacre. Tamils have faced years of violence, of being forcibly disappeared, and genocide. And that's why on May 18th, on Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day, I will be joining with Tamils across the world to light a lamp and call for an international inquiry into these crimes against humanity, these war crimes, and these acts of genocide carried out against the Tamil people by the Sri Lankan government. It is only with accountability that we can have truth and justice. Let us all work for a future where Tamil people can live with respect, with dignity, and with freedom. Vanakkam.
Vanakkam. I'm sorry that I can't be there in person with you this year, given the alert level 2 restrictions. However, I know that the 18th of May holds special significance for our Sri Lankan Tamil community, and that it is commemorated as Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day. I know that each year you come together to remember the thousands of lives that was taken during the Sri Lankan Civil War. I know that you remember the brutality, the horrors, the sacrifice, the violence, and the sorrow. And we remember with you. We remember so that we can learn from the past, never to repeat it. We remember and support your continued struggle for justice. And we share in the disappointment that you have at the lack of justice to date. We acknowledge the scars that our Tamil community continues to bear and the shadow of violence that you live under. As the Parliamentary Private Secretary to the Minister for Ethnic Communities, I want us to be a society here that ensures that those who have fled such violence and who have chosen to make New Zealand their home can truly be safe here. And I also want us to remember so that we continue to stand together against discrimination, hate, and violence. Can I also take this opportunity to thank all the organizations that work to support our Tamil community here in Aotearoa. I want to thank the New Zealand Council of Tamils and others who strive to ensure that we remember the atrocities that were committed during those war years and the continued fight for justice. Finally, can I thank all of you for the part that you've played in uniting against COVID-19. Here in New Zealand, we have not experienced the devastation that so many others have in many other countries, and that's because of our team of 5 million, of which you are a part. So let me thank you for that as well. Go well, Nandri.
Vanakkam. Hi, I'm Andrea Horvath, leader of Ontario's official opposition New Democrats. Today marks 11 years since the Mullainvaykal massacre at the end of a decades-long civil war in Sri Lanka. Today, New Democrats join Tamil community members to offer our solidarity and our support in your quest for justice and recognition of the Tamil genocide. 11 years ago, I stood with community leaders and Tamil youth when you successfully led a blockade of the Gardner Expressway in protest of the genocide and as a demand for political action and justice. In 2016, I was proud to host the very first Tamil Genocide Remembrance Ceremony at Queen's Park. And we are proud to stand with Tamil Canadians and support Bill 104, the Tamil Genocide Education Week Act. The journey is not over yet, and New Democrats are here to say that we stand with you. New Democrats support your ongoing struggle for justice, self-determination, and formal recognition and accountability for historical truth. In spite of adversity, Tamil Canadians have emerged as leaders in all sectors of life in Ontario and in Canada, whether it is business, academia, medicine, government, or the arts. And your leadership gives us all hope that despite everything that the Tamil community has endured, there will be justice, there will be peace, and there will be recognition for the people of Tamil Eelam. We see you, we mourn with you. We are here with you in this struggle. Thank you, and together, may we remember.
Vanakkam. This is Bob Blackman, MP for Harrow East. This year, unfortunately, we're having to observe Mullainvaykal, the Tamil Genocide Remembrance Day, on a virtual basis in the midst of a pandemic that has taken far too many lives across the United Kingdom and across the world. I want to take the opportunity to thank all the key workers, including all those wonderful medical professionals who are going above and beyond the call of duty to support all of us and to save lives. Today marks the 11th anniversary of the culmination of Sri Lanka's bloody civil war. It also marks 11 years of lack of accountability or justice for the horrendous war crimes committed against the Tamils. Just as the world outlook has been turned dark due to the pandemic, outlook for justice in Sri Lanka has also turned dark with the return of the Rajapaksa government in Sri Lanka. This is highlighted with Sri Lanka's withdrawal from the United Nations Human Rights Council resolutions, the only mechanism that was aimed at seeking justice. Now, I know the Tamil community, as they remember those who lost their lives in Malavakkal and across the northeast, will be resolute in continuing their struggle for peace. I, for my part, will always campaign and stand up as a voice for the Tamil community and the endeavours of the Tamil community for peace, justice and reconciliation. Nandri.
Vanakkam. I would like to send my best wishes to everyone in Scarborough's Tamil community. Usually, I would be with you in person on this day as we mark the end of armed conflict in Sri Lanka. Unfortunately, we cannot come together this year, but that doesn't lessen the importance of coming together in spirit to remember the victims of the war. This conflict went on for over 26 years, and in the last phase of the war in Mulivailbaki, in 2009, tens of thousands of people were killed and hundreds of thousands more displaced and disappeared, leaving lasting wounds in communities across the country. I join you in keeping their memories alive and in calling for justice. Sri Lanka must implement its obligations under UN Human Rights Council resolutions, and the United Nations must establish an international independent investigation into allegations of genocide. I thank the Tamil community for their contributions to Canada. You are part of the diversity that makes our country strong. Thank you, Nandrik.
Dear friends in the Tamil community of Montreal, I'm honored, if humbled, to spend a moment with you as you commemorate a terribly somber anniversary in remembrance of the genocide of some 150,000 members of our community at the hands of the Sri Lankan army. It's indeed a dark and unresolved past, and I understand that proper accountability for that terrible tragedy has not yet been forthcoming. So I'm with you in solidarity as you look back on that terrible day and that terrible time in 2009. And I trust that you find some strength and hope in the solidarity of your community. I'm seeing it in such important evidence at this very difficult time as well, as we face this uncertain and terrible virus, to see your community coming together, and I'm happy to have offered some help for those efforts. So I'm with you in solidarity, and I can only imagine the pain you all feel looking back at this terrible time and at your determination to see some accountability for it. And I share that determination with you. Thank you for your friendship and your continued involvement, and I wish you all the very best on this difficult anniversary. Thank you.
Vanakkam. I want to, on this day, stand in solidarity with the Tamil community in Brent and elsewhere as you commemorate this 11th anniversary of the killings of many Tamils. It's important that we remember, because to remember means we will never forget, and we should never forget the lives lost and the lives taken from us. I will never forget the pain of the Tamil community when they contacted me in their hundreds. So I stand in solidarity. Take care, and may we never forget.
Vanakkam. I'm Dolly Begum, Member of Provincial Parliament for Scarborough Southwest. May 18th marks the 11th anniversary of the Mulivaikal massacre, one of the darkest periods of the Tamil genocide. And although we cannot physically gather in remembrance this year, I'm thankful to the National Council of Canadian Tamils and to all the community leaders for finding new ways to bring people together in remembrance. Today, we remember those we've lost, and we commit ourselves again to self-determination, to justice, and to the recognition of the Tamil genocide. Scarborough Southwest is home to a large and vibrant Tamil population. In my last 2 years as an MPP, I have been so proud to work with strong local Tamil leaders to serve the needs of the community. Whether celebrating Tamil culture, or it was advocating for a new Tamil community center in Scarborough, or supporting Bill 104, the Tamil Genocide Education Work Week. I have been proud to stand with the Tamil community. Recognizing the events of the Tamil genocide is an important step in the path towards justice and healing. And that's why I called for official recognition of the Mullaivaikkal massacre and a moment of silence in the Ontario legislature last year this time. And I'm grateful that we received unanimous support from all parties to make that happen. And it is unfortunate that this year I cannot be with you in person to mourn together. But just know that I stand with you in the struggle for justice and for recognition for the people of Tamililam. Thank you, and may we remember.
To train the Sri Lankan troops who really went on massacring the Tamils, and in 2009 May we could see the death toll of the Tamils went up to, according to UN estimates, to 70,000. And therefore Okinawa becomes an ideal location to remember the Tamils who were killed as the Okinawans who were killed in the Second World War in 100,000s. Therefore, Okinawan people are in solidarity with the Tamil people, and the Tamil people are in solidarity with the Okinawan people. And next to my right side, we have Reverend Bishop Tani Daiji, who has fully committed himself for peace on the Okinawa Islands. Peace for the Okinawans means peace without military bases.
Vanakkam. I want to extend my thoughts and best wishes to the British Tamil community as we prepare for the 11th anniversary of Mullaivaikkal and remember those people who were killed in a genocidal act against the Tamil people. I remember it all too well, and the suffering of both the people in Sri Lanka and the diaspora here in the United Kingdom. I think it's really important that on this 11th anniversary we remember and we continue the fight for justice. As the acting leader of the Liberal Democrats, I've always been committed to human rights and peace and justice for everyone on the island of Sri Lanka. And we cannot allow this horrific incident and the events leading up to it to be forgotten, and we cannot end the search for justice. The call for an international, independent judicial investigation needs to continue. I think the actions of the Sri Lankan government, the United Nations Human Rights Council, are unacceptable. And I know the whole world is suffering with the coronavirus, and attention is not on these issues, but we can't forget. And therefore, I want to pay tribute to all those who continue to campaign, to the British Tamil Forum, and my thoughts are with you on this important anniversary. Vanakkam, Nandri.
Vanakkam, everybody. This year, as we approach the anniversary of Mullaivaikkal, we are meeting in very different circumstances, with people having to socially distance and stay at home to protect their lives and others from the global coronavirus pandemic. And it's firstly on behalf of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils that we want to say thank you and pay tribute to the frontline staff in the UK and around the world who are helping to tackle this crisis. For many British Tamils, including those living in my constituency, The sacrifice of these frontline staff today will no doubt bring back memories of the medical professionals in Mullavaikau who put their lives at risk to treat the injured in the midst of shelling and aerial bombing by the Sri Lankan security forces. And whilst we tackle the coronavirus pandemic, our work continues to make sure that we do not forget the events of 2009 and that the crimes against humanity and genocide committed in Sri Lanka will be remembered. We will continue to fight to ensure all those who committed those grave crimes are made accountable. The All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils and I will, now and always, stand with the Tamils in their pursuit for justice. Nandiri.
Hej alle sammen. Jeg håber, at I og jeres familier har det godt. I år der kan vi ikke samles, som vi plejer den 18. maj. Men vi kan være sammen i hjerterne og på skærmen, og jeg er rigtig glad for, at I holder fast i dagen. For folkedrabet på tamilerne, det er noget af det mest grusomme, vi har set. Det er noget, som ingen mennesker burde være udsat for, og det må aldrig gentage sig. Jeg tænker med meget stor medfølelse på ofrene for folkedrabet, på jer, der mistede familiemedlemmer, og jer, der var nødt til at flygte. Og noget af det aller værste her, det er jo også, at det faktisk ikke er overstået. Hver eneste dag bliver der begået overgreb på tamilers rettigheder. Hver eneste dag går de skyldige for forbrydelserne stadig rundt på fri fod. Derfor er det fuldstændig afgørende, at vi også får krigsforbryderdomstolen i Haag til at se på det her, til at vi får stillet de skyldige til ansvar. At vi får FN og EU til at være langt mere aktive i at beskytte tamilers rettigheder. Og det er noget af det, som jeg vil tage op med udenrigsministeren nu. I kan regne med, at fra Enhedslistens side, der vil vi altid stå sammen med jer i kampen for frihed og fred.
To the Sri Lankan community in my riding Laval Vizir, and to the Tamil community around the world, on the 11th anniversary of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka, we stand together. We stand together to honor those who were killed, suffered, and who survived the atrocity committed during these terrible armed conflicts. The Tamil Genocide Day is a day of remembrance and for collectively mourn those who were killed and to protect against the lack of accountability for a crime against humanity. It is for the Tamil to demonstrate resistance and resilience as we call for accountability and sustainable peace. Let us be grateful to live in a country where all kinds of violence and discrimination are prohibited and where diversity is our beautiful source of unity, of strength, and it is also the lifeblood of our prosperity. My thoughts and sympathies are with the innocent victims, their families, and their loved ones. Let us come together from home and light a candle remembering the victims. Thank you.
Ici devant la stèle du lieutenant Shangar qui a été tué en 1982 au Sri Lanka et qui est le premier martyr de la cause tamoule. Je me permets à l'occasion de la commémoration qui aura lieu demain de vous faire part de mon soutien, de mon amitié. J'ai été très fier et très honoré à l'époque en 2017 avec l'association franco-tamoule de Karcharcel d'ériger cette stèle qui est une des seules stèles en France qui honore la mémoire des martyrs du peuple tamoul. Soyez sûrs de mon soutien, de ma fidélité, de ma solidarité. Je sais que la situation dans votre pays est extrêmement difficile et qu'il faut continuer à faire en sorte de connaître et de faire connaître le martyr que vous vivez. Soyez sûrs que je serai de toujours et de tout cœur avec vous pour continuer la lutte pour la vérité, pour la liberté et surtout pour que vous puissiez vivre libre et heureux en tant que Tamoul et que vous ne subissiez plus toutes les exactions que vous subissez actuellement. Encore une fois, soyez sûrs de mon soutien, de ma solidarité et je serai toujours à vos côtés dans ce combat pour la vérité.
Bonjour. Une fois n'est pas coutume, c'est de mon bureau de maire d'Argenteuil que je vous envoie ce message pour vous souhaiter de retrouver le plus vite possible la paix dans votre pays d'origine, au Sri Lanka, Le peuple tamoul a souffert depuis longtemps des différentes exactions. J'ai d'ailleurs un ami, Siva Panudurai, qui est conseiller municipal d'Argenteuil, qui m'en a témoigné plusieurs fois. Donc c'est dans un cadre qui ne nous permet pas d'ouvrir comme d'habitude le parc des Cerisiers à Argenteuil, où une stèle est érigée depuis longtemps, un arbre a été planté depuis déjà quelques années, et donc écoutez, je souhaite que ce témoignage vous apporte le plus grand réconfort pour faire en sorte que les Tamouls soient mieux lotis, mieux préservés, mieux respectés, que ce soit dans le monde entier ou que ce soit dans leur pays d'origine. Donc, bonne commémoration, plus privée que d'habitude, bonne commémoration, et j'espère qu'on se retrouvera l'année prochaine pour quelque chose de beaucoup plus public. Bon courage à toutes et à tous.
Today, the 18th of May 2020, we remember the Tamil genocide. It's been 11 years since the murder of over 160,000 Tamils in Sri Lanka, and justice still has not been done. On this day, we remember the innocent, the men, women and children who were killed for no other reason but because of their ethnic Tamil background, their religion, their culture. There can be no justice, there can be no peace, there can be no forgiveness until the criminals who killed these people are brought to justice by the international community. Sadly, many of those who perpetrated this international war crime, this crime against all of humanity, now hold senior positions in the Sri Lankan government. These people must be brought to justice. The international community must do it not only for the families and for the victims of the genocide, but for all of humanity. Today, the 18th of May, we remember those, we pray for those who lost their lives in this atrocity. May God bless them, their families, the Tamil community here in Australia and throughout the world. We will not forget. I stand with you and I remember.
Hi, I'm Janet Davey, the Member of Parliament for Lewisham East, and I'm also the Shadow Minister for Faiths. I'm delighted to be able to address you again on such a significant day, which is your Genocide Remembrance Day, remembering the civil war that ended in 2009 in Sri Lanka, that killed terribly so many Tamil people's lives. And I know this is a particular time of grieving and remembering the lives that were lost, and also remembering the pain of many victims and the torture that had taken place. You have my deepest sympathy and my deepest regret for what happened. There's a political philosopher called Edmund Burke, and he said the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. And I know that you are good men and good women fighting to make a difference, and many of you are activists where you are ensuring that this genocide is never forgotten, and you are there fighting to make sure these human rights abuses never take place again. I commend you for that, and I say to you, stay strong and keep doing what you are doing, and also continue to look after your families and your friends and your loved ones.
Vanakkam. Hello, Mayor John Tory here, and today I join people from all over the world to commemorate Tamil Eelam National Day of Mourning. Today we pay tribute to those lives that were lost and to everyone that was impacted by the war in Sri Lanka and all of the injustices that have yet to be resolved. Many of those who were impacted by the war and by those injustices have come to Toronto to rebuild their lives and have become pillars of our community. Many of those people have played a vital role in building up our city and making Toronto a better place for everyone. It's important that even though we are enduring challenging times with this pandemic, we continue to pay our respects and honor all of those lives lost and remember those who are still suffering in Sri Lanka. Although today holds a significance to people around the world, every day we must remember that we have a role to play in making sure that no one must ever endure such a dark chapter of humanity anytime in the future. So thank you for taking the time to pay your respects.
In this month, when events are taking place across Canada to recognize the Tamil genocide, I wanted to make a clear statement. I support our former Prime Minister Harper's position of a call for an international inquiry into the genocide against Tamils in Sri Lanka. The reconciliation plans launched by the current Sri Lankan government may not provide any meaningful results. I believe that an immediate action that the Sri Lankan government must set up a hybrid court so that individuals like Canadian judges and prosecutors can play a meaningful role and make the judicial process credible. For myself, the Tamil community in this country, those that, due to the great work of a former Prime Minister and Brian Mulroney in the early 1980s, allowed hundreds of thousands of Tamils who were fleeing persecution to resettle here in Canada. Many of these Tamil family members are now close personal friends. The Tamil community will always have a friend in myself, and as Prime Minister of our country, I will continue to champion human rights.
This week, anniversary of a massive human tragedy, the massacre of tens of thousands of Tamils. They were slaughtered by Sri Lankan government forces. It was an act of genocide. Tragically, Tamils are still being persecuted. The Sri Lankan and the Australian governments tell us that the civil war ended in 2009, but there's been no satisfactory resolution. If you're not acquainted with what happened in May 2009, I urge that you view the film No Fire Zone, The Killing Fields of Sri Lanka. I watched the film again last week. It's so sad. The Sri Lankan government ordered up to 400,000 civilians to gather on beaches that they called no-fire zones. Once corralled on the beaches, civilians and Tamil tigers were bombed and shot at for days. A UN panel found that as many as 40,000 civilians may have been killed in the final months of the civil war. A Guardian investigation in 2013 put the number up to 70,000. Whatever the final numbers, clearly there were shocking crimes committed. But there's been no investigation, and Western countries have been largely silent. Australian politicians and the public, I believe, have a responsibility to speak up to ensure the promised independent investigation into these crimes is established. And most importantly, we need to speak up to help stop the crimes still being inflicted on Tamils. I came to learn about the 2009 massacre when I was a Greens Member of Parliament. In 2013, I visited Sri Lanka as part of a parliamentary fact-finding mission. On that trip, it was very clear that the crimes suffered by Tamils have not stopped. I was shocked to learn that in Tamil areas it's estimated that there is one soldier for every 6 civilians. We saw what this means for Tamils when we travelled down the east coast of Sri Lanka. We would regularly come across new army bases where once there were Tamil fishing villages. New Buddhist shrines marked the entry to these bases. We visited the region where villagers were displaced to. Now they live in wrought iron shacks far away from the coast where they used to fish and farm. They were seriously impoverished. What we saw is the face of demographic and cultural changes being imposed on the northeast region of Sri Lanka. Sinhalese settlers from the south are occupying Tamil land and homes. Streets now have Sinhalese names. Meanwhile, the crimes against Tamil people continue. Women are raped, people disappear, and land and homes of Tamil people are being confiscated. We were disturbed to hear how the military assisted by the government to run local businesses including hotels, golf courses and tourism companies. For ordinary people across Sri Lanka, the end of the civil war did not improve their lives. Poverty has not been reduced, press freedom has not been restored, and the judiciary are now under political control. It's disturbing that despite the ongoing crimes of the Sri Lankan military being well documented, that the Australian government in March this year conducted its largest ever defence exercises, the Indo-Pacific Endeavour, with the Sri Lankan military. Australia should be a force for peace, justice and human rights in our region. I add my voice to the growing call for the Sri Lankan government to end its military occupation of the traditional Tamil homelands in the north and east of Sri Lanka. This must include an end to the military control of civilian activities in this region. The priority for the Australian government should be to support the independent investigation into crimes against humanity and the war crimes, and to acknowledge the ongoing persecution against Tamils by the Sri Lankan government, and to assist Tamils seeking asylum in Australia. The Australian government should end all support of the Sri Lankan military. I believe we all have a responsibility to support Tamil demands for justice and recognition of their homeland in Sri Lanka.
11 years ago in Sri Lanka, a brutal civil war came to a horrific end in Mullivakal. Now we remember those haunting events and how devastating they were, not only to the families who died, but also to the world, to peace-loving people who abhor violence. It was there that more than 40,000 people, according to the United Nations, lost their lives. Families ripped apart by indiscriminate shelling by the Sri Lankan military. Stories of mothers running one way and fathers another, doing everything they could to protect their children from the carnage. And what the United Nations has reported happened is profoundly disturbing human rights abuses. A history of human rights violations that is totally and utterly unacceptable. And now, 11 years later, we say, not again. Not ever again in Mullivakal, not in Sri Lanka, not anywhere in the world. As peace-loving people, we come together and demand that everything be done to abhor and stop this kind of violence from ever occurring again.
Good afternoon. It's Marvin Rotran, City Councillor of Montreal, addressing the Tamil community in our city, throughout the province of Quebec and beyond. Today is a special day. We commemorate the Tamil genocide, the 150,000 people and more who died during the civil war in Sri Lanka. It should not be forgotten, 11 years after the end of this war, that most of those who died were civilians. There have been some positive efforts to build reconciliation since 2009, but for every step forward, there also seems to be one to go backwards. We have talked about a Lessons Learned and Conciliation Commission, which should have provoked major political change. It hasn't led to that. We've talked about a federal solution in Sri Lanka that would open the door to full citizenship to every Sri Lankan, whether Sinhalese, Muslim, or Tamil. There is much work that remains to be done. Let us not forget, Sri Lanka was born with great promise of a country open to all its residents. And yet, in its first years, Sri Lanka stripped hundreds of thousands of residents of their citizenship, claiming they were foreigners, even though they were born there. Sri Lanka deported hundreds of thousands of Tamils to India, and Sri Lanka refused to make Tamil an official language. Even today, with some progress, much remains to be done in this country. But for the diaspora, we should not forget the violence of the Civil War and the accusations that still stand unanswered against the Sri Lankan army for war crimes and genocide. Charges that are made by credible world organizations like Human Rights Watch. Charges that are backed by some of the instances of the United Nations. We need answers, and we need leadership from the government of Sri Lanka. To the community, I give you my solidarity today. I believe Canada has much more to play, a role to play in this matter, and that Canadian leadership can help facilitate dialogue that will lead to a lasting peace and a sense of shared citizenship by everyone who lives in Sri Lanka. I thank everyone today for the invitation to address you, and let us not forget what happened in the past, and let us look towards the future.
Hello, this is Bonnie Crombie, Mayor of the City of Mississauga, and on behalf of the City of Mississauga and the members of my council, I join you on Tamil Memorial Day to remember the hundreds of thousands of Tamils who lost their lives in their struggle for human rights. The Tamil genocide remains a very dark and disturbing chapter in the world's history. It's hard to imagine the unthinkable crimes committed during this period, carried out against innocent individuals. And on this day, let us take a moment to remember how fortunate we are to call Mississauga, and of course Canada, our home. Let us honor the Canadian Tamils who rebuilt their lives in a new country and enriched our community while inspiring a younger generation to become successful and contributing citizens in their newfound home, Canada. All residents have a responsibility to take a stand against intolerance and injustice, which have no place in Mississauga. Through the power of education, peace, intolerance, volunteerism, and self-confidence, we can do our part to make sure the crimes of the past are not repeated. Thank you.
Vanakkam, kia ora koutou katoa, and my greetings to you as the New Zealand Tamil community gathers together to remember the violence and to remember the genocide of 2009. I know that for all of you this is an extremely difficult and emotional time as you remember the violence that beset your homeland for nearly 40 years between the early 1980s and 2009. It is a time at which you remember some of the atrocities that occurred, particularly towards the end of the conflict in 2009. And for many of you it's also a time of personal remembrance and mourning as you remember friends, family and loved ones who suffered, who hurt and were sometimes killed in those terrible events. We now live, all of us here together, in a peaceful country in New Zealand that seems a million miles away from the reality of war and of genocide. But that shouldn't in any way diminish the determination that we all have to ensure that crimes against humanity, war crimes and genocide are held fully to account and are subject to proper investigation. New Zealand has always supported the position of the United Nations, which has always called for proper, independent international investigation into any serious allegations of war crimes, including those committed in Sri Lanka during the conflict, and that is the position that we hold to this day. To everyone who is remembering the genocide on this day, my thoughts and my prayers are with you, along with my determination that in the wake of events of violence, in the wake of war crimes, that there can be proper investigation and that there can be a path forward towards justice and reconciliation. And it is my hope that no matter how long it takes, we can work together to make sure that that happens. Nandri Vanakkam.
I dag der mindes vi årsdagen for folkedrabet på tamilerne på Sri Lanka. Hvordan den srilankanske hær bevidst myrdede 10.000 af uskyldige civile. I år så kan vi ikke mødes foran Christiansborg, som vi plejer at gøre. Men det betyder ikke, at kampen ikke fortsætter. Jeg vil som medlem af EU-parlamentet rejse sagen om kravet om retfærdighed for ofrene og for deres familier over for EU-kommissionen. Tamilerne, de fortjener Danmarks og EU's støtte.
This is the 11th year that we remember on May 18th, the Tamil genocide, one of the most horrific genocides of our modern times. Innocent civilians perished because of this ugly, ugly, targeted genocide by the Sri Lankan military forces. 11 years later, we still don't have accountability
or justice. I remember 11 years ago when we took to the streets, where we had protests, cries for help and attention of this mass killing. I remember it was in 2009 that I met my good friend Babu Nagalingam, who's now my chief of staff, as we were protesting together. Just like I did 11 years ago, I stand with you and will continue to do everything I can to push for justice, to push for accountability, because there can be no reconciliation. It's not possible unless there is accountability for the lives that were lost during this genocide and for the war crimes that were committed. On behalf of the City of Brampton, we remember.
Hi, I'm Paul Scully, the Minister for London and previously the Chairman of the All-Party Parliamentary Group for Tamils. Can I first of all start by saying wanakam to Tamils in my constituency of Sartmanchin, across London and indeed across the world, who are commemorating today the 11th anniversary of Mullavakkal, that last bloody battle in Sri Lankan's long-running civil war. It's disappointing not only to see little progress in achieving truth, reconciliation and justice to bring an end to that island's dark chapter in its history, but also to note that the Sri Lankan government themselves have pulled away from their commitment that they made to the United Nations to make progress on this. We as parliamentarians must make sure we can do all we can to bring pressure to bear on that government for the benefit of the Tamil people. But on a positive note, I celebrate what British Tamils have been doing in this extraordinary time of coronavirus and how it's affecting our society. They have been on the front foot as our doctors, our nurses, our carers and essential workers. And I want to say thank you to each and every one of them that actually show what the British Tamil community have developed and become such an integral part of our community that makes Britain great. Thank you.
Today, the Canadian Tamil community and Tamils around the world are remembering the Mullavakkal genocide in Sri Lanka. Although times are challenging due to COVID-19 and the measures that entails, Tamils have shown incredible resilience in remembering the innocent civilians, the victims, and ensuring that there is a demand for justice. In 2009, the Tamils in Sri Lanka were subjected to a genocide at the hands of the Sri Lankan government. And despite 11 years passing, Tamils around the world and in Sri Lanka are left with no answers for the hundreds of thousands of lives that were lost. Thousands of people have been displaced and have been missing for over a decade now. Over the years, Sri Lanka has shown no efforts in providing accountability and justice for the human rights abuses against Tamils. As Canadians, we put forth important principles of justice, equality, and peace, and the rule of law. And I stand behind the Canadian Tamil community in seeking justice for those who were killed at the hands of the Sri Lankan government, and for those who have been subjected to genocidal acts. I want to offer my support to Canadian Tamils and the Tamil community everywhere during this solemn time of remembrance, and will continue to call for accountability from the Sri Lankan government for the human rights abuses that took place in Mullavakkal.
I wish all the Tamils a very special remembrance of Mullavakkal. It is an incredibly sad time. It speaks of memories from a series of pogroms and atrocities and the genocide of the Tamil people, who once had autonomy and no longer have suffered over 70 years since the independence from the hands of the Sri Lankan government. The Tamils deserve to be respected. They deserve to have their autonomy. They deserve to have justice. And it is incredibly sad that the government of Sri Lanka has announced its withdrawal from the only co-sponsored resolution of the UN Human Rights Council after 10 years of delays and just delivering what is really superficial progress on its commitments. May I all wish you again a special time at this remembrance to thank all the Tamil community, the great Tamil community of the United Kingdom, and I wish you all well, justice, autonomy and recognition of the genocide. I wish you all well at this time of Muli Vaikal. Thank you.
Today marks the 11th anniversary of the Mulivaikal atrocities. Many Tamils in Ilford South and across Britain will be not only thanking this country for the refuge that it's given them, but more importantly, renewing calls for justice, for a demilitarisation of Tamil homelands in northern Sri Lanka, and for the UN to be heeded and international observers for its calls to actually seek justice for those that lost their lives at the end of a near 70-year conflict on the island of Sri Lanka. And as your local MP in Ilford South, you know already that I'm focused on human rights right across the world for oppressed peoples and listening to all sides of any debate. But clearly, there does need to be justice, and the Tamil people of Sri Lanka need justice and need their right to self-determination in northeast Sri Lanka.
Hello, this is Sean Chen, Member of Parliament for Scarborough North, and I'm very honored to join all of you for this online event in recognition of Tamil Elam National Day of Mourning. Allow me to begin by first expressing my condolences to all the victims of Muli Vaikal, to all victims of destruction, conflict, and war in Sri Lanka. This May, we mark the 11th anniversary of the end of the armed conflict in Sri Lanka. Yet accountability, peace, and justice have not been achieved. That is why last year, in May of 2019, I first moved the motion in conjunction with my colleague, Gary Ananasangari, in Canada's Parliament to call on the United Nations to establish an international independent investigation into allegations of genocide against Tamils in Sri Lanka during the last phase of the armed conflict. It is so important for all of us to recognize history, to ensure that we educate the next generation so that they never repeat the mistakes of the past, and to find closure through acknowledging history, to ensure that there is dialogue, a peaceful path forward, and that perpetrators are held accountable for their actions. The wonderful thing about Canada is that we value our peace, we value social justice, we value reconciliation, and that is why I was honored and pleased to know that our Parliament unanimously adopted this motion, and to ensure that we continue to uphold those principles that we hold so dear, that we are setting that positive example for the world. So I thank all of you for participating in today's event. I thank all of you for ensuring that we continue to remember the lives that were lost, and that we continue to speak out for truth, for accountability, and for justice. Nandri Vanakkam.
May 18th is a day of mourning for the Tamil community here in Canada and around the world. As we remember the horrific crimes that were committed at the end of the Sri Lankan Civil War. In the last Parliament, I proposed a motion to the Foreign Affairs Committee calling for Canada to support an independent investigation into declaring these crimes genocide. Canada should support that independent investigation, and my motion was ultimately adopted unanimously by the Foreign Affairs Committee, and a similar motion passed in the House of Commons. These motions need to be followed up by concrete action by the government to hold those responsible of serious international crimes accountable. This follows the legacy of former Prime Minister Stephen Harper, who boycotted the Commonwealth Summit in Colombo to protest ongoing human rights abuses targeting minorities in Sri Lanka. Conservatives have also called for the use of Magnitsky sanctions. The Magnitsky Act, passed by Conservative MP James Bazan, that would allow direct targeted sanctions of human rights abusers. Strong action to defend justice and human rights is required. Canada must become a leader again on these issues by championing a principled foreign policy, and I look forward to continuing to work with the Tamil community on these vital issues.
Good evening. My name is Siobhan McDonough and I'm the Labour Member of Parliament for Mitcham and Morden. May I thank you all for asking me to join you here this evening as a long-standing friend of the Tamil community and behalf of the hundreds of my Tamil constituents and neighbours who live in my community. Last year I joined many of you in Parliament Square to mark the 10th anniversary of Mulivaikal. Fast forward to 2020 and none of us would have anticipated that we would be gathering remotely in this way. These are truly extraordinary times. Life has turned on its head and every family is facing their own difficulties. And although the cases of coronavirus in Sri Lanka are far lower than here in the UK, all of us are united in the hope that brighter days are not too far ahead. But whilst the world battles with coronavirus, life still carries on. Last month marked the first anniversary of the terrible Easter Sunday bombings which tragically killed 269 people. We pause to remember all of those families who lost loved ones on that horrible day. And today marks 11 long years since the massacre at the Mulivaikal. 11 years with so many challenges, so little progress, so much pain. The images of those final days are scarred in my memory. The mass violation of human rights left a stain of injustice on Sri Lanka. The world looked away, but today we will not. Today we gather to honour the memory of all those who died. We reflect on the road to reconciliation that lies ahead, and we reaffirm our strong belief that only truth, justice and accountability will set Sri Lanka on a path to lasting peace. May I take this opportunity to offer my very best wishes to you and your families at this difficult time. I stand with you today and indeed every day. Thank you.
Bonjour, je suis très fier d'être à vos côtés depuis plusieurs années et tout particulièrement dans ce contexte de pandémie virale. Je souhaite vous demander de vos nouvelles, savoir si vous vous portez bien, vous dire encore et encore de vous protéger et en protégeant les autres, et puis de respecter tous les gestes barrières, les consignes de sécurité sanitaire que nous entendons toutes et tous. La communauté tamoule, votre communauté, est particulièrement solidaire depuis plusieurs années, mais aussi dans ce contexte de lutte contre la propagation du virus. Vous vous demandez, parce que c'est un événement important qui a du sens, ce que nous allons faire à Sevran pour la cérémonie du 18 mai. Nous commémorerons encore une fois cette année cette cérémonie pour le devoir de mémoire, parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier le génocide, parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier vos morts, nos morts, parce qu'il ne faut pas oublier qu'il est important de faire justice, parce que tant qu'il n'y aura pas la justice, il n'y aura pas la paix. Donc je souhaite vous inviter à cette cérémonie du 18 mai que nous organiserons ensemble, dans un contexte évidemment particulier, en faisant en sorte que nous ne nous mettons pas en danger, mais surtout, je suis convaincu avec vous qu'il est important de ne pas oublier et d'organiser ensemble cette cérémonie. Merci à vous et portez-vous bien.
I'm Stephen Timms, the MP for East Ham. I want to extend my greetings to everyone on this occasion of the 11th Mulivaikal Remembrance Day, and especially to those who are mourning friends and family members who died at the end of the Civil War 11 years ago, and those who still don't know what became of their friends and relatives at that time. And we know from the regular reports of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights that the problems didn't end there, and that they still haven't ended, and that many in Sri Lanka are still suffering today. I've supported the UN Human Rights Council process. I went to Geneva with the British Tamils Forum. I'd hoped to visit during this most recent session in March, but with the pandemic, unfortunately, that didn't work out. I hope, though, that the world will insist on an independent international inquiry into what happened at the end of the civil war in Sri Lanka, and insist as well that steps to deliver accountability, justice and lasting peace for Tamils in the northeast of Sri Lanka are finally delivered. David Cameron, then the British Prime Minister, initiated the process based on the UN Human Rights Council resolution. The resolution was co-sponsored by the government of Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka hasn't kept its side of the bargain. So that gives us in Britain a special reason to insist that the very moderate commitments in the UN resolution must be delivered. The promises were made to our Prime Minister. That is going to need an international independent investigation of the kind we've seen elsewhere in Syria, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, the IIIM, Myanmar, the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, IIMM, in order to break through the impunity in Sri Lanka, which has hardened since the election of the current government. I send my greetings to everyone for today.
It's now over 10 years since the terrible events at Mullavaikal. That was when Sri Lankan state forces persistently bombed an area where thousands of Tamil civilians had taken refuge. The Sri Lankan state encouraged people to go there. They told them they would save, and then they bombed them relentlessly. It was a war crime. I want to see those responsible brought to justice. The estimates vary from 10 to 100,000 in terms of the number of people who lost their lives that day. But however many it was, it's clear that thousands of innocent Tamil people lost their lives at the hands of the Sri Lankan state in circumstances which were completely unjustified. So this anniversary is a time to remember the grief of those who lost relatives in the massacre. It's a time to remember all those victims who tragically lost their lives. And it's time to renew our commitment to accountability and justice in Sri Lanka, to see that those who are responsible for war crimes are brought to justice.
Vanagam Ulaha Tamil Makale. 11-årsdagen for folkedrabet på tamilerne i Sri Lanka bliver mindet. I maj 2009 blev ELAMs tamilske frihedsbevægelse nedkæmpet med en massiv srilankansk militæroffensiv. 146.000 tamiler forsvandt på få måneder, og 70.000 blev dræbt. Alene blot fordi de var tamiler. Det er forbrydelser, som vi aldrig må glemme, og som vi aldrig kommer til at glemme. Jeg har valgt at sende min lille hilsen til jer her fra Christiansborg. Jeg ser i det såkaldte grundlovsværelse og sender min hilsen. Og netop fordi, at denne hilsen også omhandler grundlæggende retfærdighed, grundlæggende retsbevidsthed, respekt for menneskerettigheder, så har jeg valgt at sende min hilsen her fra grundlovsværelset. Nu er tiden kommet, hvor vi skal tage de næste skridt. Vi skal have Sri Lanka for den internationale domstol i Haag. De krigsforbrydelser, de forbrydelser mod menneskeheden, der er blevet begået, dem skal vi have undersøgt, og der skal afsiges dom. Jeg håber, at vi snart igen må kunne mødes fysisk, og at vi kan tage en god dialog, en god demokratisk debat omkring de her temaer. Tak for ordet.
Mes chers amis, comme vous le savez, la crise du coronavirus qui frappe la France, le Sri Lanka et le monde depuis plusieurs mois nous contraint à réduire fortement nos rassemblements et notre circulation. Dans ces circonstances exceptionnelles, ma présence à vos côtés en cette journée de mémoire si importante n'est malheureusement pas possible. Croyez bien que je le regrette sincèrement. Malgré cela, en tant que député de Seine-Saint-Denis, je suis intervenu auprès du maire de Drancy et j'ai obtenu que ces commémorations du 18 mai puissent avoir lieu devant l'hôtel de ville de Drancy, dans ma commune. Ces cérémonies ne pourront malheureusement pas accueillir autant de personnes que nous le souhaiterons, elles sont forcément limitées. Pour autant, il aurait été impensable de les annuler et pour l'ami du peuple tamoul que je suis, de ne pas y prendre part, même de manière indirecte. C'est pourquoi je tenais à vous transmettre ce court message vidéo. Je souhaite tout d'abord vous adresser une pensée émue à vous et aux milliers de Tamouls victimes de massacres et d'épuration ethnique lors de cette guerre sanglante qui a frappé le Sri Lanka pendant de nombreuses années. Je souhaite également adresser une pensée fraternelle à ces femmes et à ces hommes qui ont éprouvé la disparition de proches, à tous ceux qui ont été déplacés de force et à ceux qui ne demandent qu'à pouvoir enterrer leurs morts pour enfin arriver à faire leur deuil. Évidemment, je n'oublie pas ceux qui, encore aujourd'hui, sont victimes de persécutions religieuses, de violences politiques, de marginalisation et d'arrestations arbitraires. D'ailleurs, je crois savoir que les autorités du Sri Lanka exploitent cette crise sanitaire qui bouleverse le monde pour écraser encore un peu plus le peuple tamoul. Alors que la violence d'une telle crise devrait au contraire servir de ciment pour unir le peuple, comme ça a été le cas dans de nombreux pays du monde. Certains forcenés l'utilisent au Sri Lanka pour servir leurs intérêts et accroître encore un peu plus leur pouvoir. Si ces commémorations du 18 mai permettent de rappeler et de dénoncer les crimes de guerre et les crimes contre l'humanité commis au Sri Lanka, elles servent également à mettre en lumière tous les endroits du monde où les libertés fondamentales sont constamment bafouées. Ces commémorations du 18 mai nous rappellent de surcroît l'échec et la passivité de la communauté internationale qui n'a pas su apporter une protection aux plus fragiles, qui n'a pas été capable de faire cesser l'épuration ethnique qui se déroulait pourtant sous ses yeux. En ce 18 mai, je souhaite donc vous adresser un message de paix et d'espoir pour le Sri Lanka. Pour autant, cette paix que j'appelle de mes vœux ne pourra advenir que si la justice est rendue de façon effective. Il est donc urgent que les crimes commis par l'armée sri-lankaise puissent faire l'objet d'enquêtes internationales à la fois impartiales et indépendantes. Les bourreaux, qui ne connaissent pour l'heure que l'impunité, doivent répondre de leurs actes devant la Cour pénale internationale. De même, la paix ne pourra pas advenir que si une solution politique, inclusive et durable prend réellement corps au Sri Lanka. Pour cela, il est nécessaire que les persécutions cessent, tout comme il est primordial que la militarisation et la colonisation du nord-est du pays s'arrêtent définitivement. Les territoires spoliés doivent être rendus. Enfin, afin que leur identité et leur culture puissent pleinement s'exprimer, une large autonomie doit être accordée aux populations tamoules au sein du Sri Lanka. La paix et la réconciliation sont des cheminements longs qui passent inévitablement par le dialogue et la manifestation de la vérité et la justice. En tant que patrie des droits de l'homme, la France doit peser de tout son poids, tant par ses relations directes avec les autorités sénégalaises que sur la scène internationale, pour que ces cheminements soient rendus possibles. Ce sont les vœux que je veux formuler en ce 18 mai, en tant que représentant de la République française et en tant qu'ami du peuple tamoul. Je vous renouvelle mes pensées les plus fraternelles en ce jour si particulier et je vous dis à très bientôt.
Vanakkam, I'm Wes Streeting, I'm the Labour MP for Ilford North and Vice Chair of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Tamils. Normally today we would be gathering together at events to commemorate and reflect upon the horrific events of Mullawaikal, the final days of the Sri Lankan Civil War that saw terrible atrocities and human rights abuses committed. For obvious reasons this year that's not possible, but I want to extend my support to all of those families who today are mourning and grieving, but also to give you a reassurance that I and other members of Parliament across all political parties will be working together, not just to make sure that the prosecution of historic human rights abuses remains on the international community's agenda and that we see truth and justice and reconciliation come about, but also to highlight the ongoing human rights abuses in Sri Lanka during this lockdown. We're with you, we'll be campaigning with you and for you, and we will not rest until justice is delivered.
The Tamil community has lost a great deal, continue to being affected by these incidents. This is why this bill is even more necessary, because through this bill, the House would help in honoring the memory and naming the atrocities faced by the Tamils in Sri Lanka as genocide. Furthermore, an education week provides an opportunity to reflect on and to educate the public about the enduring lessons of the Tamil genocide and other crimes against humanity.
It is incumbent on political leaders to name it and to shame it, to acknowledge the genocide that was committed, to acknowledge and recognize. As Benjamin Dix said, the communications manager for the United Nations in Sri Lanka between 2004 and 2008, quote, "It is very fair to say that the Sri Lankan army committed genocide. The atrocities in Sri Lanka were definitely towards ethnic cleansing. There may be foreign governments and foreign agents who choose not to recognize this evil for what it is, but we know it to be genocide. And we have a duty, a moral duty, to say so. As a conservative, but most importantly as a Canadian, I am proud that we have legislation that is here to educate the next generation, but also here to remember the sacrifices and atrocities committed onto the generation behind us.
It seems unimaginable that such a massacre could have been unfolding for so long, just halfway across the world. Yet this is exactly what happened. There are few words, if any, that can really capture the kind of devastation and crimes against humanity that took place. But genocide is one of them, and of that, there is no doubt.
The recognition of the Tamil genocide and further education about it will serve to be an enormous milestone in this healing process. Recognizing such atrocities can help strengthen the Tamil community.
The Tamil people, when you look at what they have endured when they came to this country, I think you would agree with me that they are one of the most successful immigrant communities that we have ever had in this country.
Tamil Genocide Education Week is important for all Ontarians, for all Canadians, even those who are not Tamil, so that we can better understand the injustices that our Tamil neighbors have gone through and continue to go through.
The existence of a mass grave in Jaffna, containing the bodies of those who had disappeared in previous years. There are reports of up to 300 to 400 bodies being buried in mass graves near the village of Chamani.
The people of Tamil Eelam have suffered, and the history of mass disappearances and killings in Sri Lanka paints a dark picture of neglect and violence.
There was one survivor who was in the bushes and they thought he was dead, but he saw what happened. One person was chopped up while he was still alive. In my father's case, they poured acid on him to burn his body.
The perpetrators deserve to be held accountable for the terrible bloodshed and the experience that was experienced in Sri Lanka. The survivors of the Civil War deserve that justice.